Hello and welcome to part 13 in my ongoing series on young earth versus old earth creationism. Today's video ought to be a good bit shorter than most of the videos in this series have been, and the reason for that is that we're going to be focusing on one particular narrow issue, namely the question of, was Jesus himself a young earth creationist? Now, when I was growing up as an independent fundamental Baptist and a dedicated young earther, I heard this being maintained all the time, not just from young earth teachers themselves, those who are involved in Genesis apologetics type work, but also just from pastors and regular Bible teachers in the pulpit. There's an incident in the life of Christ that's reported on in two of the Gospels where he gave the Pharisees an answer regarding the institution of marriage, and he refers back to Genesis. And based on this, the way that Jesus talks about this, pastors and teachers and Genesis apologetics types argue that Jesus must have had an extremely literal view of Genesis, including the 6 days of Genesis, the idea that everything was created from the beginning of the cosmos to the creation of man in 6 literal 24-hour calendar days. And since they thought that the text showed this, it was therefore incumbent upon believers to accept this as well. If you were a Christian, you should believe in a young earth because Jesus did. As we know from John's gospel, Jesus was the agency of creation, the one through whom the Father created all things. Therefore, as certain people in the young earth community like to say, he was there and we weren't. Therefore, he knows the truth. He is the Son of God after all. So if we're going to argue for any conclusion other than a young earth, this is what they maintained, we must therefore either be thinking that Jesus was mistaken or just outright telling us a lie. And a good follower of Jesus Christ, a good Christian, anybody who wants to claim to be a Christian, certainly should not find themselves arguing for any such thing. So we were told it was basically incumbent upon us to believe that the earth was young as well, regardless of any other interpretations of Genesis, regardless of what science had to say on the matter and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to be getting into here. Now, as always, if you have not seen the previous videos in this series, I do recommend that you go back and take some time to watch those and listen to those. Many of them are made without very many graphics. They're more or less set up so that you can just listen to them and get all the content that you need. In this series, I've covered a number of topics already, biblical authority, the early church fathers, the days of Genesis, that sort of thing. So as you're thinking, if you've been drawn to this video in particular because of the issue of Jesus and young earth creationism, you may have other questions, maybe other objections to any other interpretation than the young earth interpretation. And it's a good chance that I've already addressed those. So if you go back and watch the rest of them, I think that you'll find them very helpful. In particular, with regard to this episode and what I'm going to be talking about here, I recommend watching episodes 3 and 6. These are the ones that I did on the early church fathers, the ancient Jews, what they thought of Genesis, how they looked at creation, and also what the days of Genesis actually are. I make a detailed case for how I think we need to understand the days of Genesis and what's being said there. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and get into this. Now, the standard young earth argument that comes up in the creation controversy, where this idea of Jesus himself affirming a young earth is concerned, is based on two passages again in the Gospels, Matthew 19, verses 3 through 5, and Mark 10, verses 2 through 8. Now, in these passages, the Pharisees came and questioned Jesus regarding divorce, and he gives them an answer here, again, that's considered significant with regard to Genesis. So we'll read those. First of all, Matthew 19, verses 3 through 5. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'?" Now moving on, we'll read Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 8. Where the same story is told with a bit of a different perspective. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh." Now, commenting on this incident, young earth teacher Henry Morris, who was one of the authors of the very influential young earth book, The Genesis Flood, Morris argues that old earth claims directly contradict what Jesus tells us in these two passages, and that a young earth understanding is the only way to go here. So, quoting Morris here, "The Lord Jesus, on the other hand, who was there, having himself created all things," note John 1, 1 through 3, "taught that men and women were made essentially at the same time as the cosmos itself, when he said that from the beginning God made them male and female," Mark 10:6. The beginning obviously was a reference to Genesis 1:1, and Christ was specifically citing Genesis 1:26, unquote. Now, you'll note here that Morris qualifies his statement, saying that man and woman were created essentially at the same time as the cosmos itself. Why does he qualify his statement in this way? There's a very good reason for it. Because he knows that Jesus' statement cannot be taken in a rigidly literal fashion. According to the Genesis text, humans were not made at the very beginning of creation, along with the formation of the cosmos, but rather they were made at the end of the process. In fact, they were the very last thing God is said to have made. For this reason, Morris writes of the beginning of creation in the sense of the general time period during which everything got started. In this sense, the whole creation week is the beginning. And while not technically accurate, Morris is comfortable with this idea because he views the days of creation as 6 literal calendar days. In that scheme, given that so little time passed from the creation of the cosmos to the creation of man, 6 whole days, man might as well be said to have existed from the beginning. So this is basically a matter of close enough is good enough. And I understand that way of thinking. I would agree with that. I don't have any quibbles with this. If we're talking about 6 literal calendar days, then a 6-day gap is really no significant amount of time at all. So if Genesis is really telling us that everything was created in 6 actual days, then man really has existed basically from the beginning. It's not worth arguing about there. Now, on the other hand, Morris would undoubtedly find it absurd to argue the same way from an old earth position, given that, according to this framework, humanity did not come along until billions of years after the cosmos began. In that sense, man does not appear on the scene anywhere near the absolute beginning. Now, I understand this point of view, and I'm actually quite sympathetic to it, given that when I was a young earth creationist, I felt the same way. It seemed absurd to me to think that this could work with an old earth paradigm, given the passage of time that's involved. But let me give you a few reasons why I believe that it does work, and actually works quite well. First of all, when we look at this account in the life of Christ, we have to understand that Jesus was not offering us a Genesis commentary. He was not doing a commentary on the creation week. He wasn't drilling down into the text and explaining it to us. He simply plucked out what God had to say about the institution of marriage and used that simple point to answer the Pharisees. He didn't go any further with it. The argument that young earth creationists are making is an extrapolation from Jesus' words. They're making some assumptions. They're saying, well, since he said man existed from the beginning, that only makes sense if the beginning is a very short amount of time. Therefore, the young earth view must be true. So we have to keep that in mind here. This is an assumption that they're making when they argue this way from the text. The second point I would bring up here has to do with yet another assumption that young earth creationists are reading into the text. And this is a very simple assumption. I don't even think that they're really conscious of the fact that they're doing this. Building on the first assumption that the text only makes sense if we're talking about a very short amount of time, and therefore that must mean 6 literal days of creation, they further go on to assume that because Jesus referenced it, it must therefore be literal. And that's really all it is. Jesus talked about it, therefore we should accept it as literal. The alternative is that Jesus either got it wrong or he was misleading us. That's the paradigm, the either or that they offer us here. If Jesus talked about it, it's either literal or he's just got it wrong. So do you really want Jesus to be wrong? That's where they leave you hanging. And the Christian obviously doesn't want to be put in that position. But there's another way of looking at this. and is very consistent with the way Jesus taught. Anybody who's familiar with the Gospels at all, you don't have to be a theologian, you don't have to drill down deep into this stuff. If you've just read through the Gospels, it should be very plain to you that Jesus habitually taught in parables. In fact, the Gospels tell us that he did not teach the crowds without using parables. Now, what are parables? They're stories for the purposes of making some sort of point, usually a spiritual point. Examples would include the parable of the sower, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the lost coin, these sorts of things, the parable of the lost sheep and the lost son, the prodigal son. These are very famous stories, but they are not literally true. Jesus created these stories. He fashioned these stories in a manner similar to Aesop's fables in order to make certain points. This has always been a teaching tool throughout history. It was very common in ancient literature, and we still commonly do this kind of thing today. We make up stories to convey points, to illustrate things. Now, bearing this in mind, if, as I have said elsewhere, Genesis is itself a type of parable in which God depicts himself as a landowner going about the business of organizing his property in preparation for handing it over to a manager, then the simple fact that Jesus references it does not make it any less symbolic. It doesn't magically undergo a transformation and suddenly become literal. If it was a parable or a symbolic story to begin with, then it remains a parable or a symbolic story. And Jesus did quote such things from the Old Testament. Let me give you an example that no one can dispute. That has to do with the parable of the vineyard. Jesus did not make up the parable of the vineyard. He quotes it from Isaiah. In the story, as you may recall, there is a landowner who has a vineyard, and he rents it out to some managers to take care of it for him and to give him the proceeds at the proper time. Well, the managers ultimately decide that they're going to keep it for themselves, and they're not going to give the owner anything. The owner sends them various servants to try and negotiate with them, and some they beat and others they kill. Finally, he sends his son to them to try to negotiate with them, thinking, well, they'll respect my son. As it turns out, they don't. They view him as the heir, and once he's dead, they can rightfully claim the land. So that's exactly what they do. Now, Jesus quoted this against the Pharisees, and they realized that it was against them. He was the son in the story, and the idea was that they were jealous of him and they wanted his inheritance for their own, so they were going to kill him and seize it for themselves. So there's a reality behind the parable. It represents something very real, but it remains a parable. The actual story itself did not take place. It's not literal history. So Jesus, again, referring to something does not automatically make it literal. If Genesis is symbolism, if the story, specifically the creation story, was conveyed in symbolism, then it remains symbolism. And that's perfectly consistent with what we see in the text of scriptures I've just illustrated, and it's perfectly consistent with the way that Jesus himself habitually taught. So there really is no problem there. So in light of all of this, the third point I'll bring out here is to illustrate how the old earth paradigm still works, given Jesus' reference about man existing from the beginning. Again, when we looked at it from the old earth aspect, it seemed to work perfectly fine because, well, there's not much difference here. Just 6 days, it's not worth splitting hairs over. We consider the entire creation week to be the time of the beginning. Well, it works the exact same way for the old earth view if the creation week is symbolism. Why? Because the symbol and the reality behind the symbol are two different things. Jesus is referring to the story in the text, which is the symbol, not the reality behind the symbol. Again, it's just like the parable of the vineyard. The parable is symbolism and is not to be confused with the reality behind the symbol. The two are different. Yes, there is a reality, but the story used to teach the truth about that reality is not itself literal. So if you don't have a problem with that, then you should not have a problem with Genesis being symbolic and remaining symbolic even though Jesus refers to it. Unless, of course, you're prepared to just throw out all the teachings of Jesus because they become automatically invalid unless they're literal. I don't really think anybody wants to go there. Now, this leads me to a potential objection that's worth noting here, especially because what Jesus had to say had to do with the institution of marriage, and this ends up being something of a litmus test with young earth creationists as far as how people read the Bible and certain values that they hold to and that sort of thing. The objection is this. Well, if you're going to say that the creation account is symbolic, then were Adam and Eve real people? Because, as young earth creationists will argue, if Adam and Eve were not real people, then the institution of marriage that Jesus is referring to here in his discussion with the Pharisees also cannot have been real. Therefore, God did not really institute marriage between man and woman, and you can make up whatever you want to based on that. Now, in getting into this, first of all, let me say that I completely understand the objection. When I was a young earth creationist, I thought the same way. I've since come to think a little bit differently, and in light of what I've already gone into in this video, let me lay it out for you this way. First of all, I do believe that Adam and Eve were real people. If you're interested in the details on that and how I believe that Genesis is not at odds with what science has learned about how long man has existed on the earth, then I suggest you go back and watch part 12 in this series where I deal with the origins of man. But moving on, even if you are of the opinion that the early chapters of Genesis are all mythic type history and that Adam and Eve were not real people but are archetypes or figureheads or simply symbols for man and woman, male and female in general, then no, Jesus' point is not invalidated. Again, you have a symbol and you have a reality behind the symbol, and the symbol somewhat reflects the reality. And simply the fact that it is a symbol does not invalidate the point that's being made. Again, if it did, you'd have to throw out all the parables of Jesus because they're not literal. So if Adam and Eve were not real people, but God did institute marriage between man and woman, and Adam and Eve represent man and woman, put forward as two figures in a story so that we can better relate to them, then the point remains. God instituted marriage between man and woman, between male and female. The point does not fail if the two people used to illustrate the point are symbols. And I hope I'm being clear on that with regard to what I've mentioned previously, again, about the parables of Jesus. The people in the parable of the vineyard were symbolic. They were fictional, but they were used to illustrate a truth that remained valid in spite of the fact that fictional characters were used to represent it. Same goes with Adam and Eve here. Let me give you another example. There are some very good, very conservative-minded theologians who are open to the possibility that the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis were not real, literal trees, but they are instead symbolic. The tree of life would be symbolic for God's covenant favor, for people remaining in a state of obedience to God and enjoying his favor and the possibility of physical immortality as a result. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil would therefore represent disobedience, rebellion, the lack of God's favor, being expelled from the place of favor. So the point that's being made there in the story is that man and woman, humanity together, chose to rebel against God, chose not to remain in obedience to him, but rather chose to go their own way, to become effectively gods unto themselves and make their own choices. And therefore, they were cast out of the place of God's favor, unable to enjoy direct fellowship with him and all the benefits that are derived from that, but rather death became their portion, death and toil and everything else that we read about in Genesis chapter 3 and following. What the matter really boils down to here is the intent of the text. Is the text making a mistake? Is it getting something wrong? Or is it presenting things to us in a symbolic fashion? Those are two quite separate things. So no, the point is we don't have to look at this as either you see this literally or else it's just wrong, because there's the possibility that the text is employing symbolism in some fashion. In fact, those who hold to, or favor at least, a mytho-history view of early Genesis and Adam and Eve could easily point to the way that Jesus phrases his answer to the Pharisees, where he simply says that in the beginning God made them male and female. So they might easily ask, well, if Adam and Eve were two real historical persons, why doesn't Jesus name them? And it could be answered that, well, he's referring back to the story in which they are named, so it's not necessary for him to name them. He knew that they were literal people. But then the mytho-history advocate could come back and say, well, maybe he knew that they were symbols and that's why he doesn't name them. That's why he just says male and female. And at that point, given that Jesus did habitually teach in parables, and the Bible does use symbolism to convey underlying realities, you really have something of a stalemate there. There's really no way for either side to prove the other one wrong. Now, I know as I say this that young earth creationists are going to come back with all kinds of dire warnings. People like Ken Ham have done entire presentations on what happens if you don't look at Adam and Eve as real people. But again, unless you're going to invalidate all of the teachings that Jesus made based on his parables, because they were not literal stories, you've got no case here. The fact that the Good Samaritan was not real does not invalidate Jesus' point about what it means to love your neighbor, or the fact that he used a person from a despised group of people to shame the Jews into thinking that maybe they ought to do better. All of those points remain valid, even though the Samaritan himself and the man he rescues in his story are not real. So to be honest with you, friends, the basis upon which Ken Ham and others issue these dire warnings is simply invalid. If the text is intending to present man and woman, male and female, symbolically by giving us two named people to better relate to, then the point that God instituted marriage between man and woman still stands. It's still valid. Nothing falls apart here. We don't lose a literal institution of marriage by God between male and female simply because God chose to illustrate that union with a non-literal Adam and Eve, any more than we lose the requirement to love our neighbor simply because Jesus chose to illustrate that requirement with a non-literal Good Samaritan. This is really an argument that young earth creationists need to stop using. Not that they're going to, but I put this out for what it's worth, and it's coming from somebody who believes in a literal Adam and Eve, so make of that what you will. The point, just in summary here, of all of this that I've gone into, no, an old earth paradigm does not invalidate what Jesus was talking about, because if Genesis was conveyed in symbolism, then Jesus is referring to symbolism, and Jesus has the right to do that. It doesn't automatically become literal simply because it's Jesus referring to it. In the final analysis, I maintain that this young earth argument that Jesus must have believed in a young earth is far from the knockout punch that young earth creationist teachers want to maintain that it is. I think that it's actually baseless, as it reads intent into the Genesis text. You have to assume literalism from the beginning, and you have to assume that if Jesus referenced it, then it must therefore be literal. But I've given you a number of reasons why these things simply do not hold water. So I hope that this presentation has been helpful to you. I hope that it may have helped to answer some questions, and even if you are a young earth creationist, you would at least understand that when old earth creationists look at the text, that we're not calling Jesus a liar. We're not assuming the Son of God was mistaken and the one who created all things simply somehow forgot how he did it, or misreferenced all of this, or any of the kind of sensational ballyhoo that you get from some in the young earth creationist camp. Not all, but some. Some of them get quite belligerent over issues like this and just outright accuse you of calling God a liar and that sort of thing. That's not what's going on here. The young earth argument on this case really is very, very thin, and there's a couple of different ways that you can look at this. I hope that I have at the very least laid out a case for why that's plausible. So thank you for your time and attention here. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and feel free to share it around. If you're not subscribed to the channel and you're interested in doing that, please do subscribe. All of these things help promote visibility for the videos and the channel itself. I have quite a bit of other content here. I've been concentrating on the creation debate of late, but I do have other content on this channel that may be of interest to you and may be edifying to you as a believer. And if you have any feedback, please leave them in the comments. I do enjoy getting comments on these things and knowing how effective these presentations are and what people think about them. So I would definitely appreciate all of that. If you'd like to donate to support the channel, there's a link for that in the video description as well. So once again, thank you for your time and your attention, spending time here when you could easily be doing something else. And I hope to see you in the next video, which will cover one of the most contentious issues in the creation controversy, and that is the flood of Noah. I'm looking forward to getting into that and putting some perspectives out there that I think will be of interest and help to many people. So until then, thank you very much, and God bless.
Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor mine eyes lofty. Neither do I exercise myself in great matters or in things too high for me. Surely I have behaved and quieted myself as a child that is weaned of his mother. My soul is even as a weaned child. Let Israel